I met Michael DiTullo a few years ago when we were neighbors in Encinitas. He'd commented on the standard H sticker on my car, and we've been friends ever since. I had the pleasure of talking all things creative with Michael several weeks ago in his home, where it was only confirmed he's more than just your typical designer. We talk about what it was like growing up on the East Coast, and when asked what he wanted to do as a child, his response, "I want to design stuff for the future." Well, that he did as he went on to work for some of the most respected design agencies in the world, as well as other heavy hitters in companies such as Nike. He's designed watches, headphones, cars, and even shoes for Michael Jordan himself. You know those running shoes known as Nike Free? He had his hand in those too. We talked design inspiration, what makes for good design, why he turned down a job from Nike right out of college only to accept one years later. This conversation is a great example of why having a dream mixed with passion and a healthy work ethic may just be the perfect recipe for success. I'm your host, Wesley Smith, and you're listening to the Standard H Podcast. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Awesome to be here.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me in your home, of all places. Very, very hospitable of you. Just jumping right into it. Where did you grow up? What was childhood like? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I grew up outside of New York City, about an hour and a half train ride straight up the Hudson. And it was an interesting place to grow up because you knew there was something really big, really close by, but you also knew you were not in it. So it was a lot of like post-industrial towns. I was born in a town called Poughkeepsie and grew up outside of right outside of Newburgh, which is kind of like a post-industrial city, but where we lived, it was like a lot of apple orchards and very rural. But you know, a train ride to New York City, so grew up kind of going down there. My mom would take us to Broadway shows and shop around, and so it was an interesting time, especially kind of growing up at that time, getting into Grand Central. You know, in the 1980s, you know, it's very different. It was a different place.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. And then being kind of remote like that, I guess that would sort of force creativity upon you. I mean, I guess we'll get more into that, but...
Yeah, I think, you know, I was always kind of inventing my own ways to keep myself entertained. Where I grew up from when I was born, basically, until I was about 12, there was like 10 other kids on our street, all about the same age. And so we were always just like making up games and, you know, like putting all the toys in a pile and picking each other's toys. And that was really kind of amazing. You just go outside and, you know, mom would be like, come back at lunch.
Yeah, back when kids went outside to play.
Yeah, and just like roving around like a whole block, right? And, you know, to like ride my bike a few blocks to the corner store and play Galaga and get some noun laters and like a very, very like pleasant. And then when I was like 12, we moved way out to the country in the middle of the apple orchards, and that was a real culture shock because the closest kid was like a mile and a half away, and I didn't like him that much. But you're like, that's who I got. So yeah,
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned your mom. What did your parents do?
My parents were. My mom just kind of did a bunch of different jobs. Growing up, she worked retail a lot. She worked in a jewelry store, and she always loved kids, so she would babysit a lot. And growing up, my dad was an entrepreneur. He owned a small chain of kind of gourmet grocery stores that ended up going bankrupt when I was little. I mean, I remember it.
Wow.
So you have this like, you know, this kind of lean Christmases. And then he was just like a stock boy at a grocery store. And my mom basically put him through college. And so he got a degree in economics and then ended up working in economic development. So, but on the creative side, there's always a lot of creative people in my family. My dad is the drummer, my uncle's the drummer, my grandpa played the saxophone. In fact, my grandpa LaFalce, my mom's father, they had it was a huge family, like a huge Italian-American family, 11 kids, 9 boys, and each of the 9 boys played a different instrument and sang. So they had a jazz band.
Yeah, full band.
Yeah, it's like a big band.
Yeah.
And they would like play around the Catskills. So we always had a lot of music.
Like gigs?
Yeah.
They would play. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
they
not
were
when
like
I was born, but
right,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But like proper big band
Yeah.
as like all brothers and sisters, or all brothers, I guess.
Yeah, and like grew up in like a 2-bedroom apartment, like
That's
there's pictures
amazing.
of them all practicing in the kitchen of this tiny apartment. And I think they even had a couple of TV appearances.
Well, their neighbors must have loved them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, as long as they like jazz. And then they, they kind of like went to the war, and then got married, had kids, all ended up doing their different things. But just kind of grew up with a lot of music. And after my dad lost the business, we moved in with my grandfather. And so it was kind of a multiple generations. So you had my grandfather, who was a musician. My mom's brother, my uncle Mark, was living with us, who was also a drummer. He was in a band called Agit Popped, and then he toured with the Macons, and kind of a lot of post-punk kind of stuff. And then he was going to art school at that time. So, here I am in like 3rd grade learning how to draw in perspective. And
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that was a huge influence.
That was the door opening.
Yeah, and I just was always drawing, and that was a way to kind of entertain myself. Once we did move out to the country, and I'd come home from school, and I would open up the Sears catalog, if you remember what that is.
Yeah.
And Amazon as a book, for those of you that are too young. And I'd open it up to a random page and be like, oh, there's, whatever, power drills. I wonder what the future of power drills will look like. And I would draw it. And I was doing that at age 13, which is basically what I do now at age 43 as a job, right?
So as a 13-year-old, you were already thinking about the future. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
I mean,
as opposed to just making it better in current day.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I was, an 80s kid, completely infatuated with Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and Aliens and Predator and like every, sci-fi thing. Like, I think I was like, after begging my parents, I think it was probably like 10 years old when I watched Blade Runner. You should not watch that movie when you're 10 years old.
Not when you're 10.
No. And watching like 2001: A Space Odyssey, and like, I just thought, I don't know, I just thought there had to be a job where somebody was imagining what the future would be like.
That's really interesting, because you're basically not just thinking about the future, and you're obviously engulfed in this like sci-fi type of fantasy world, but it's everything but what you're living.
Right.
It's everything except an apple orchard.
Right. Yeah.
Basically. So obviously there's that level of escapism, I guess.
Yeah. And I was not an outdoorsy kid, like, by any means. I was not like into sports. I was not good at sports. I wasn't into like nature. I was just happy to like be in my room, like building things out of Legos, taking stuff apart and drawing. And it definitely was like a way to escape and go to another place. And I remember having to, when you're a kid and you're like in English class and you have to pick a book to read, and just wandering through the bookstore trying to find something, and I stumbled across the like science fiction section,
right?
And ended up in middle school reading like all this classic science fiction by Isaac Asimov and like Ender's Game, and even getting into some like Philip K. Dick stuff, who wrote the original short story that Blade Runner is based on. And so I was always really in my head and trying to kind of imagine these worlds that these authors were writing about. And I think it really just inspired me.
You have a brother, right? How many siblings?
Just one brother.
Just the one brother. Now, was he into this stuff too, or?
We have a lot of really similar tastes, ironically. We're 8 years apart. So I'm in a way almost more like an uncle than a brother. We never really fought over anything, which was great. And I think as a teenager, it can be challenging because you're like 18 and you're kind of like the caretaker of this 10-year-old while your parents are working. Right. But as adults, we're super close, and we really have a lot of the same tastes in science fiction and mid-century modern design and music, and I think we get each other excited about things. He ended up going to school for photography and film video, so also a very creative guy.
That's cool. So you were obviously introduced by way of your uncle, right? Mm-hmm. Like showing you how to draw in perspective and stuff. So then did that translate into classes that you would then take early on? Like say, I mean, did you have mandatory art classes in elementary school, or is that something you could, like I went to a school where we had electives actually, so I could choose art back then. Yeah. Did you do that kind of thing? Like what was the setup there like early on when you were 9, for example?
We had mandatory art classes in elementary and middle school, and that was pretty basic, but I had some really good art teachers, and they were pretty cool about just, being like, okay, why don't you just go over there and do what you want to do? You don't have to do what the class does. And that was, I remember this Mr. Kelso was my middle school art teacher, and he was just awesome. And he had an art club. And so like, I think it was once or twice a year, he would get a bus to take all of us down to New York City, and we'd go to the Met, we'd go to the Guggenheim, as middle schoolers. It was pretty amazing. Yeah, it was really cool. Yeah. And then we had electives in high school, and I don't know why. We really lucked out to have this awesome high school in that we had all of this huge tech department. So we had like architectural drafting and design drawing. Like in design drawing, I remember one of the projects was you had to like design 3 concepts for a phone and then do a survey with all the students to be like, which phone would they like and why? And I'm like, man, it's kind of my job now. So that was an elective. And then just getting into some more advanced art classes. We had I remember the design drawing teacher was Mr. Wagner. God, so crazy to remember these people, right? Because they shaped your life at the time. And then in the fine arts teacher who I took painting from was Mr. Becker or Belker, and he was Scandinavian. He was from Europe. I always remember he had this like pretty pimped out Volvo wagon, like the high spec version. Yeah. And Mr. Beekman,
shout out to Sweden.
Yeah, totally. and he was just awesome. I remember I got in trouble once and got detention, and he swung by the detention room and he's like, hey, I got this kid. I'm going to make him clean up the art room. And he'd like go to the art room and he'd be like, all right, just sit down there and draw. Don't get in trouble again.
Wow.
Yeah, just like really, I had some really great teachers. And so I even remember I took like an independent study in high school just to like make my portfolio to apply to art school. And he was super helpful.
That's really smart. What'd you get detention for?
I was probably, if I got bored in a class, I just
space out.
Yeah, or just act out, talking like I get in trouble for talking to girls or whatever. So.
That sort of brings us to kind of like when you started to think about doing it for a living, I guess. Mm-hmm. Obviously you had sights on design school for college, obviously.
Yeah.
Was it that early on that you wanted to do that for a living? I mean, obviously you mentioned earlier that somebody has to do this, right? So why not me? That was the mentality, I guess. Mm-hmm. That's like, I don't know, like foreshadowing being the right word, but like that's very self-aware, I guess.
I don't know where I got that insight from, to be honest. It's like not many kids.
Insightful.
Yeah, have that. Yeah. And I mean, I remember kind of 2 key stories. When I was 13, my parents asked me what I wanted to do when I grow up. And I said, I want to draw stuff from the future. And I could tell they were just like, that's, totally baffled. But a few weeks later, my father found on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which my father read every day, there was an article about Giorgio Giugiaro, who, designed the DeLorean, the original Volkswagen Golf. And there was like that Wall Street Journal style of illustration. There was an illustration of Giugiaro, and then there was a drawing of a car he had done, a tennis racket, and a cruise ship and a piece of pasta that he had designed to hold sauce better. And my dad was like, is this what you want to do? And, it said he was an industrial designer. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. Right. And so
you finally had a label.
I had a name, right? And had I had not made that prior statement a few weeks before, that article might have passed me by, and I might never, it might have been years. And a lot of my colleagues don't find out about industrial design until they're into their bachelor's degree, because it's just not a lot of awareness. And that's always frustrated me. How many great designers are we missing out on in the field because they just don't know about it until it's, quote unquote, too late and they're already down a career path, and it's hard to switch. And then I ended up going to the Rhode Island School of Design. And so I knew what it is I wanted to do. I didn't really know where to go. My guidance counselor I'll never forget, was like, yeah, you want to be a mechanical engineer? I'm like, no, it's called this other thing, industrial design, not mechanical engineering. It's, that's not what it is. And freshman year of high school, I was in algebra class, and I was bored out of my mind. I think it just, it's just like if you already understand the concept, but somebody else doesn't, and the teacher's got to repeat it. And so I was kind of in the back of the class, just like drawing furiously in my notebook. And my teacher, Mrs. Jacobus, kind of is lecturing and kind of comes up behind, and I'm just in my own world back there. And she slams down her hand on my notebook and rips the page out, crumples it up, and says, "Come see me after class." And I was terrified. I was like, I'm in trouble again, And I come to see her after class, and she takes the crumpled up paper out of the trash, and she smooths it all out, and she writes on the top, Rhode Island School of Design. And she said, my brother went here for architecture. Write this pre-internet. So she's like, write them a note so you can get their catalog, and you should probably go there for school. And I ended up going there.
So she was your direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mrs. Jacobus.
Did you even consider going anywhere else, or were you just like, wow, this must be the great place?
I did. I once I kind of understood what types of schools had industrial design, they have these portfolio review days. So I think I went to one down at Pratt in Brooklyn, and I did a tour of Pratt, and I interviewed with Pratt, RISD, which is Rhode Island School of Design, Syracuse University, College of Creative Studies in Detroit, and Art Center in Pasadena, and RIT. And I'll never forget when I interviewed with the guy from RISD, and I poured out my portfolio. He said, "Oh, we got a young Giugiaro here." And I was like, "What?" That's exactly what I'm trying to do. So that was amazing. And
quite the compliment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, maybe he was being sarcastic, but in my mind, it was amazing. And then I toured Pratt, and at the time, Bed-Stuy, it was not as nice as it is now. And I remember, because Pratt gave me an acceptance and a scholarship, and I asked one of the students, I'm like, hey, is it pretty safe to go out, around school? And he's like, oh, yeah, it's totally fine. Just don't go out in groups less than 3, and don't go out after dark. And I was like, I just don't know. And he might have been messing with me.
Maybe you misunderstood the question.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know if I want that to be my experience. I went and checked out Syracuse, but it was just like a giant university, and that didn't feel right. I went up to RIT, and it was just like super cold.
Sorry, what is RIT?
Rochester Institute of Technology.
Rochester, got it. Upstate
which
New
has
York.
a really good ID program. And then I went to RISD, and it just kind of felt right. It's kind of the campus is commingled with Brown, and it's an urban campus, so it's kind of like a few regular buildings and then a RISD building, and it's not really like a closed campus. So you're really kind of part of the city, and it's just Providence is like a beautiful small city where you can have fun and can't really get into too much trouble, but you can take a train to Boston or New York pretty quick. So, and it felt good because it's like 4 hours away from home, so you're like away from home, but not. I flew out to Art Center, and I was like, man, this is for
far.
Yeah, in pre-email days, this is feels really far.
Yeah, payphones.
Yeah, totally.
When I was at boarding school, that's how I communicated with my parents, is through payphone.
Oh my God, that's
which
wild.
Now we're going way back.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of a trip to be that far away from home. But do you remember what you drew in that class that she crumpled up?
Oh man, I have no idea. That's a good question. I wish I had that. I do have some drawings from that time period though. I have like some old like Nike drawings and car drawings.
Okay, so you were into shoes and cars early.
Yeah. And I think for me, I think when you're a kid, before you can drive, like shoes are your car, right? That's kind of like your transportation. And I had an interesting experience. I think my elementary school, I went to Catholic school. So, we're all uniformed out, couldn't wear sneakers. And so you don't really have a sense of style because it's just what you have to wear.
Cookie cutter.
Right. And then when I went to middle school, my parents asked me like, hey, do you want to go to public school? I was like, yeah, I want to go. Yeah, that'd be great.
I just want to wear my own shoes.
Yeah, I don't have to walk in like a straight line, down the hallway, military style. That'd be great. So, I show up to school and I'm like, man, all these kids are wearing these red, white, and black sneakers with a check on the side and some wings. And I come home, I'm like, Mom, I got to get those shoes. Like all the cool guys have those shoes. And she gets me, we go to the store. I'm like, yeah, I think those are them. I get them. And everybody's making fun of me the next day. I'm like, why are everybody making fun of me? They're like, dude, you got Pony City wings. They're the knockoff Jordan 1s. Like, I come home, I'm like, Mom, I can't wear these shoes. She's like, well, you got to wear them now. We just didn't have money to afford those shoes. So I think it was like a my way of attaining them was to draw what I thought the next ones. Oh, I wonder what the Jordan 6s will look like, right?
Right. Back when they were just called the new Jordans.
Right.
As opposed to the numbers.
Right. Yeah, totally. So I was really into shoes and cars and electronics. I have like all these drawings of like mini disc players and just all kinds of, funny things like that from high school. And then
I totally forgot about mini disc players for a minute. Wow. Blast from the past as well.
Yeah. This is another shout out to my brother. He got deep into the mini disc.
Oh, really?
He had like a component mini disc system at home and an in-dash mini disc for his car and a portable mini disc. And I'm like, this is the future. I love you, brother,
sick.
but I don't think so.
I love it.
Yeah. And so when I went to college, that's what I was trying to focus on. And I did a sponsored project for Nissan, for Chrysler, and then for Nike. So
yeah. So what were some of the early influences on you back then?
In terms of other designers, it always was Giugiaro and Raymond Loewy, who was really one of the first industrial designers, one of the first to kind of call himself by that term. And I look at those guys from the early era. You've got Raymond Loewy, who had a really successful consulting practice, and Elliot Noyes, who was head of design at IBM, who would, hire Noguchi to design their gardens or the Eames to design an office building. Right. And so, and he was, really like the first VP of design. And so I think you had this really interesting moment post World War II where design was really respected. Raymond Loewy he designed Air Force One. He designed NASA's Skylab, the first space station. He designed the Shell logo. He, designed bunch of Studebakers. So, and architecture and furniture. He was really working across all these categories, and it's like you never saw him not in a double-breasted suit. And of course, he was this very debonair French guy living in Palm Springs and in the 50s and 60s. But it was really taken very seriously. And there's kind of a really fascinating minor shout out to him in the movie The Aviator, where DiCaprio is playing Howard Hughes. Right. And there's a moment where they're looking at some parts for a plane for TWA, and DiCaprio, the line is, "Get Ray Loewy on the phone." This is the guy who was on the cover of Time magazine. And so to me, I wanted that level of respect and I guess notoriety sounds like a dirty word, but the reason for it is so that you can do the kind of work you want to do for the kind of clients you want to work with. Sure. And to me, that's what it's always been about, like about building my portfolio, building my personal brand, building my studio and my name. It's all about, can I get the freedom to do the kind of work where I could feel like that 13-year-old where I'm drawing stuff from the future.
Not being told what to draw necessarily.
Yeah, and not being so iterative. And so, and I think where I've really shined is when I've had the room to develop something that was a little bit different, and helping companies to take risks, basically, to get out from under the like, well, this is what our competition is doing, so let's chase it. And by the time you chase it, it comes out 12 months later, well, your competition's moved on. So the only way to lead is to try to leapfrog and get out ahead. And that is inherently scary. And that's okay. And I talk a lot of what I do with clients is helping them through that. And, you know, multiple times when I've pitched concepts and I'll have a client and they'll be like, this really scares us. And I'll be like, that's great. I'm like, what do you mean it's great? We're scared. I'm like, because if I didn't show you something that scared you, why would you pay me all this money? You know, that's right. Literally my job is to bring you the thing that you haven't seen before. So the fact that you are right now saying we haven't seen that before is a sign that I'm providing value to you. And now let's talk about what are, you know, the strengths and opportunities around this concept. You know, what are the potential pitfalls, and let's work backwards from it, versus, you know, retreating back into something that's iterative.
We'll jump around here for a second. So you're kind of touching on like your current philosophies with your own design firm. Going back, leaving RISD, what were some of your first jobs? Like what was that? The resume, right? If we could like jump through the resume real quick. Sure. Like what are some of the early gigs you had? So
I was, you know, doing these sponsored projects for pretty big companies. And I graduated in 98. Nike had kind of softballed me a little bit of an offer, but I wasn't graduating for a couple months, and I unwisely didn't like accept it and get it in writing. I was kind of like, well, let's see what else happens, right? Just like an idiot. And then I graduate, and I was like, well, how do I get a job now? Like, I don't even, how does this work? And I called Nike, the head of design at the time, Dave Scanoni. He's like, yeah, we just had like our worst quarter ever, and we have a hiring freeze. I'm like, what's a hiring freeze mean? He said, we can't hire anybody. I'm like, well, like for how long? He's like, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 months. I'm like, oh my God, like I need a job now though. And so I moved back home. I applied for some jobs at like Smart Design, at Frog, at Continuum, and I got rejected from all of them. And so I was like, man, what am I going to do? And I interviewed out at Adidas. I interviewed at Sea-Doo, you know.
The jet skis?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just like nothing was working out. And I was like, well, you know, I could sit on the couch and at my parents' house and watch cartoons all day, or I can just go, you know, they had like a big basement. There's a ping pong table down there. I was like, I could just set that up as my studio and basically pretend like I have a job. And so I got a couple of freelance gigs, and every week I would work on my portfolio. And then on Fridays, I'd mail out these books of my portfolio. And after about 6 months of doing that, it was getting pretty disheartening. But after about 6 months of doing that, I started getting some callbacks. And I got a call back from Continuum in Boston, which is a pretty big firm. And I got a call back from this small firm at the time in Connecticut called EVO, EVO. And at the time, there was just 4 people there, two partners, a junior designer, and a biz dev person, and a receptionist, so maybe 5. And I just really connected with the junior partner, this guy, Aaron Szymanski, who is only 8 years older than me. And you know, he says he doesn't remember it happening this way, but I remember coming in and him being like, I only got 30 minutes, so let's be quick about this. And I was just like, oh man, I'm going to lose another one. And 2 hours go by and he's like, why don't you just hang out here? I got to go talk to the senior partner real quick. So, he's talking to the senior partner for like 30 minutes. And then he's like, all right, let's go outside. And he gives me an offer on the spot. And, I was just like, he's like, so, think about it if you want to think about it. I'm like, no, I don't need to think about it. Like, I feel good about this. Like, there's a connection here. This is a person I can learn from. It was a small firm, but they were doing pretty big work for big clients. And so I ended up working there for about 4.5 years, and about a year or two into it. And the cool thing is like, you think like you're hot shit when you're out of school and you go somewhere and you're like, I'm the worst guy here.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like, what were some of the things you said in the interview? Because like I've been in interviews in the past where like, you knock it out of the park kind of thing. And then there's other interviews where you're like nervous the entire time because you're like, oh my God, I don't think they like anything that I'm saying. Yeah. Like what were you guys talking about? Anything of note? I
mean, we're going back to 1998 now, but
sure.
But I think what I remember is I had just brought so much work, and I built all these books of like, oh, here's a book of architecture, here's a book of housewares, here's a book of consumer electronics, and
so you were literally illustrating that you were like a multidisciplinarian as far as like the different.
And I built it in different books so that I could, one, easily kind of edit, and two, if the interview was going poorly, I could be like, well, that's all I have. And if the interview was going well, I could just pull another book out and keep it going.
Oh, they were categorized.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. So like they were like, bound, like Kinko's bound books.
Yeah.
Of sketches and models and photographs of models and things. And so, it was going well, and I just kept pulling out another book. And he's like, oh, man, you got architecture too. And Aaron had an ID degree, but he worked for a commercial interior design firm for years. And he also was very kind of multifaceted. So I think we just kind of like were very like-minded, and he saw that.
So you were just two peas in a pod at that point.
Yeah, and I think he was like, here's a guy who's hungry and I could take under my wing. And I was like, here's a guy I can learn from who's going to push me because he's better than me. Sure. And, I would be, at the time we had like two desks, like you had a computer desk and a drawing table. And I was drawing for 8 to 10 hours a day for years. And I remember early on, he'd come over, we were working on a project for Fisher Price or Libby Glassware, and I'd be sketching on it all day, and he'd come over and he'd be like, all right, Michael, show me what you got. And so I'd pitch him all my ideas. I usually have like 8 to 10 concepts after the day. And he'd be like, all right, give me that one, that one, that one. He'd go back to his desk, and in 10 minutes, he'd be like, okay, here's what you should have done. And I'd be like, wow, like this dude can just in 10 minutes take my whole 10 hours of work and like put together the idea.
But that's really great that you got that kind of immediacy, right?
Totally.
And that constructive criticism so quickly.
Yeah. And
so you learn so much faster. What took you 10 hours might seem like forever, but it's a day.
Yeah.
And you probably had all these lessons. That's amazing.
And like he was using me to like generate raw ideas, and then he was coming in as the director and like curating them and then just drawing it out into one. And I'll never forget the day he came over and just looked at what I had done for the day and was like, looks great, send it to the client. And you're like, no changes? He's like, nope, just send it over. And so it really means something. Sure. And I mean, in between there, I remember the firm was growing. I think we'd probably grown to about 10 people, was doing really well. And we were doing a project for Timex. And so, all the designers who were a little older than me were really like, it's a pretty cool project to do a watch. And I was doing some concepts, and the vice president of design from Timex was coming in to review concepts. And I didn't have many that made it to the board, the big presentation board. But my boss, Aaron, came over, and I had this little thumbnail. I mean, literally like a 2-inch sketch. And he was like, what's that? And I was like, well, they're saying they had this innovative movement inside, like the way he set the alarm and stuff was really interesting. It's like they want to show that this is a different kind of a watch, and I just thought like, well, all watches are symmetrical, so maybe it should be asymmetrical. It was just like kind of a, and he was like, yeah, okay, give me that. And he goes to the photocopier and he blew up the little 1.5, 2-inch sketch to 11 by 17, like huge, and then just like pinned it up in the center of the board. And the VP of design came over from Timex because they were not far away. His name was John Houlihan. And I remember John came right in. He was like, what's that one? Pointing at my thumbnail. And my boss, Aaron, was like, that's the one that we're going to make. And he's like, yep, let's do it. And that went to production. So it was a really cool place to work because you really saw everything. As a 22, 23-year-old, I was presenting to these veterans and learning so much. And for me, I felt like, well, I'm not the best here, but I have a lot I can learn. And I definitely could come in earlier than anyone, and I can leave later than anyone.
Yeah.
So I would, at the end of the day, photocopy all of the designer sketches who I thought were better than mine, and I would take them home and I'd just like study them. And one day I was working late. It was probably like 7:30 or so, and I get a phone call. And literally I pick up the phone like, hey, Evo Design, this is Michael. I was the only one in the office back when we had desk phones. And the guy goes, hey, this is Dave Scanoni, head of design at Nike. I want to hire you guys for a project. It was the guy that had offered me the job a few years earlier that I messed up.
Did he remember you?
And I was like, Dave, this is Michael DiTullo. I went to RISD. I was that idiot kid who basically like
turned you down before the hiring freeze.
Right. And he was like, oh my God. Yeah. Okay, cool. He's like, well, let's do a project. And so I ended up working with Nike through Evo with, they have several different advanced design groups. There was the Innovation Kitchen, and then Dave had left his role of head of design of footwear to be the head of what was called the Explorer Group. And they were doing all these really cool collaborations like with Herman Miller and just like, what's the future of this brand and where can we go? Right. And they were working with Astro in San Francisco, and then and working with IDEO and Continuum and us at Evo. And I think, I did like 6 months straight of projects. And basically they're like, you want to come work here again? And
you're providing all this content.
Yeah, I didn't mess up that time. And so I flew out, and for that interview, I remember I put together these giant posters, like 4 feet by 8 foot, and they're just the concepts.
So multiple items on each page.
Oh, like 100 concepts on a poster.
Wow.
And I had like 4 or 5 of those posters, and so I just like rolled it out on the table, and they were just like, holy shit. And we were doing that at Evo. We would do those concept posters and send them to them. And I went, when I took a tour, I went to Dave's office, and I saw a few of the posters hanging up behind his desk, and I was like, oh, cool. My work's still up, like, 6 months later.
That's amazing.
So,
now, what's the point of doing it on one page so that you can see the evolution of the creative?
I think it's just like, it's a little bit of a shock and awe. It's like, instead of slowly flipping through one page at a time. Like,
so it's to just visually backhand somebody.
Pretty much.
Like to stop them in their tracks.
It's I call it a surplus of innovation. You're like, here's like way more ideas than you could ever make, and
that's a really interesting approach.
Each one would have a theme, like, oh, here's the theme on like lightweight running, and it's just like, bam, here's 100 ideas on lightweight running.
That's amazing.
So
that took you to Nike.
That took me to Nike, and I had interviewed at a bunch of shoe companies. I knew I wanted to leave consulting because I felt like I already had a great experience at a consulting firm. And I also felt like we would do work and people would be really happy, but a lot of times it wouldn't make it to production, or if it did make it to the production, it would be pretty changed. And so I was like, well, what's going on that I'm not a part of where this is happening? And so I knew I wanted to go corporate, and I really enjoyed doing footwear. So I was like, oh, if I'm going to go from doing this really broad spectrum of work into only one thing, I think footwear would be the thing. And then Nike had reached out, and I was like, well, all I really know is Nike. So I just proactively called a bunch of companies, and I ended up interviewing at Reebok, Adidas, Converse, Nike, and Diesel at the time, where they had a studio in Santa Barbara. And Nike wasn't the highest offer, but they all offered me jobs, by the way, which was amazing.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
But Nike had the largest market share, right?
And it just felt right. Again, like I'm very much like, it's like and I went there and like the people were nice, and I just felt like I was going to learn more, and that's what I wanted.
Now, was Adidas was still outside of Portland as well?
Yeah.
Okay, so they had their campus there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it.
And so I took the job at Nike, and a few places. I also interviewed at New Balance, yeah. And a few, like, I remember Diesel, like, upped their offer a couple times. I'm like, guys, like, it's just not about the money. I want to go here, And I got offers from a couple of different groups at Nike, because it's a lot of groups.
Sure, yeah.
And I accepted the offer to work in a sportswear group, because at the time, it had just basically been formed. And basically for 30 years, Nike had been making shoes specifically for specific activities, and this is the first time they were going to basically acknowledge that they were a huge lifestyle crossover and design products for that. So I did that for 2 years, which was super fun. I worked on some ACG stuff. I worked on a lot of women's high-end product for like European and Asia specialty retail. And then I don't know, after a couple of years, I really wanted to work in Jordan, and I had become pretty close with John Hoke, who is the head of design for footwear. Now he's the chief design officer for the whole company, all brands. And it just really I remember I was just drawing at my desk, working on a concept one day, and all of a sudden I hear this voice behind me like, "Hey, Michael, I just want to let you know I see what you're doing, and you're doing good work." And somebody scared the crap out of me, and I looked up, and John Hoke who's kind of tall, he was looking over my cubicle while watching me draw. I had no idea how long he was there for. And I was like a little terrified, because he's like my boss's boss, right? And I was like, "Hey, John, you want to go to lunch?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure." And we grabbed lunch, and he's like, "Hey, why don't we have lunch once a month?" I was like, "Cool, awesome."
So you were designing ACG and things that weren't Jordan.
Right.
But you were drawing Jordan in like your free time, and that's what he saw?
He saw me working on an ACG thing.
Okay.
But so we would have...
But he was just respecting the work.
Yeah.
Got it.
We would have lunch, once a month or so. And he's like, "Michael, I got shit the other day because somebody was like, 'Why do you always get lunch with DiTullo and not other designers?' And he's like, I had to tell him. He's the only one that asked." He's like, nobody asked me to go to lunch. And that's just my nature. Like, I'd ask Tinker to go to lunch, and I'd ask all these guys, because like they're all super nice guys and they'll spend time with you. So in one of these lunches, I say to John, like, "I'd really like to work in Jordan next." And he was like, "Michael, there's been 12 designers in Jordan ever, like since the 80s. And there's footwear designers that have been here for 20 years. You've been here for 18 months.
Now, was Tinker Hatfield?
He was at the time running
was he the first Jordan designer?
Actually, he was not. He started with the Jordan 3.
Okay.
That's a
story. Yeah, that's a whole other story. I know that he's famous because of that shoe.
Yeah.
He basically saved the Jordan brand, right?
Yeah.
Because of that design.
It's true.
Right.
He kept Michael at Nike, and he did Jordans 3 through 15, and then 20 and 23. But so John was like, he's like, why should we give it to you? And I'm like, well, I've just always loved Jordan since I was a kid, but obviously everybody says that. And I was like, I will work harder than anyone. And, and he's like, well, Michael's retired, and he's like, he's like, Jordan might not even be around in a couple years. I'm like, no, it's going to be around. Like, I think it's going to be bigger.
The chief designer of Nike said that it could be theoretically.
Yeah, I think he was pushing back, and Jordan wasn't doing that great at that time.
I see.
And I was like, I think it just needs to grow from an athlete brand to an idea brand. And I think it became a brand that became about a core idea of kind of excellence and the best. I think they really did an awesome job of turning Michael Jordan into a concept.
A lifestyle.
Yeah.
In an incubator for it.
And so he was like, fine, go talk to Dwayne. Go talk to Dwayne and see what he thinks. And Dwayne Edwards was the head of Jordan Design at the time. And Dwayne is amazing mentor, personality. And he started after he left Jordan, he started a school for footwear design in Portland called Pencil.
Cool.
But so I go to Dwayne. I was like, hey, Dwayne, my name's Michael DiTullo. And he's like, I know who you are. And I was like, you don't have to introduce yourself. I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't know. And I really want to work in Jordan. He's like, yeah, John told me. And he's like, here's what we're going to do. He's like, I'm going to give you a brief, and you're going to design a shoe on the weekends, in addition to all of your regular work. And, if that goes well, then I'll consider you for an interview. And I was like, totally fair. And he's like, that's cool. You're super eager to do extra work. I'm like, well, worst comes to worst, I still have gotten to work with you on Jordan. So what do I,
So I'm going to bring you a 4x8 sheet of paper full of 100 sketches.
Yeah. Well, I was like, what's a few Saturdays, right? And so, he gave me a brief to do a trunner, like a Jordan training shoe. And he would, I'd send him concepts. He'd give me feedback, and he'd be, I could tell he was trying to see how it would take his feedback. And sometimes it'd be very specific. Sometimes it'd be nebulous. Like I remember, one time he looked at my sketches and he's like, okay, how about I want to see more integration between the soft part of the shoe, and the midsole and the outsole. Make it more three-dimensional. Like, all right, no problem. I came back a week later, and he's just like, whoa, you went way beyond. You crushed it. Good job. He's like, why don't we? Every quarter, they have a meeting called Concept Review, where the president of footwear reviews all the footwear designers' work. So the time was Mark Parker, who's now the CEO. He's like, I think this project is good enough. Why don't we present it at Concept Review? And I was like, well, is that going to be... Oh, I was like, okay, well, good luck with that. He's like, no, I want you to present it. And so I was presenting sportswear work, right, the previous day. And then the second day I come back and present with Jordan. And I remember Eric Sprunk was there at the time, who I forgot his title, but he was basically the head of product. And then Mark Parker was there. And they're like, Michael, what do you presented with sportswear? You're not in Jordan. I'm like, yeah, I did an extra project for Jordan. And it went really well. Mark liked it, and we came out, and Dwayne was like, congratulations, you got the job. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, a little extra work.
Yeah, it goes a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what year was this approximately?
That was probably, I went to sportswear in 2003. So that was probably 2005. So Dwayne was the lead designer at the time on the 21 at that time.
Got it.
Yeah.
You're basically working in Jordan, and you got FaceTime with MJ.
Mm-hmm.
If I can call him MJ.
Yeah, sure.
What was that interaction like?
It was intense. I mean, I was in quite a few meetings with him over the 2.5 years I was in Jordan. And he's just really smart. I remember the first time Dwayne was presenting the Jordan 21, and it was an intense meeting. I mean, it was a lot of people trying to show work, and I mean, he even, he kicked somebody out of the meeting for, he does not like people that kiss up to him. And he felt that this person was kissing up to him, and he asked him to leave. And so I'm just, the new guy kind of in the corner, and Dwayne is presenting the 21, and on the bottom, there were these interchangeable cushioning pods. And on the bottom, originally, there was the emblem of Michael's fraternity. And so Michael goes, why did you put my fraternity logo on the bottom of the shoe? And Dwayne's like, oh, we thought it'd be a pretty cool detail, and it's a story element, and this and that. And Michael's like, okay. He's like, well, isn't our biggest consumer is the suburban white kid? Like, what does this kid care about this black fraternity? And Dwayne's like, yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. And he's like, well, have you considered the fact that there's 5 black fraternities, and you put one of their emblems on it, the other 4 are
You're going to alienate the other 4.
The other 4 aren't going to buy the shoe. I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. And he's like, well, isn't Asia Pacific our biggest growth market? So this is even less relevant to them. Like, yeah, that's a good point. And he's like, lastly, you put it on the bottom in the traction. So for the few guys that are in this fraternity, what if they perceived it as an insult? And
Like you're stepping on the brand.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a good point. And he's like, yeah, take it off. And I'm like, that's just he's off very quick.
Yeah.
You know?
I was going to say off the cuff.
Yeah. I mean, he thought of 5 things immediately. And so it was really fun. I mean, it was intense and fun to present him work. And because if he liked it, it was going, you know, and he was pretty involved at that time. So that was a real privilege.
That's really cool. Because, I mean, obviously, like, everybody knows Michael for being Michael, the basketball player, and arguably the even golfer, right?
Right,
like
yeah.
he's a huge golfer.
He's an icon, you know.
But nobody knows that much. Or I mean, at least I don't know that much about him as a business person, right? Other than his name and label and everything's worth bukus of money. That's really cool. You designed a backpack for him too, right?
Yeah, so I think, again, just goes back to, for me, I wanted to work on as many things as possible there. My first immediate boss at Nike was not as understanding. You know, his thought was like, oh, I'm not giving you enough work. and Dwayne saw it totally differently. He's like, this is awesome. He's like, because there were, I think, 4 of us on the footwear design team for Jordan at the time. He's like, but because you are so interested in so many things, we will have more influence. So we were sitting next to the apparel group, and I became really close friends with still a great friend of mine, Alan Strack, who's also a DJ, goes by Mr. Strack, and just like an amazing apparel designer. And you know, we would just hang out a lot. And he was like, hey, like, I'm working on some hoodies. Like, do you want to design the zipper pulls for him? I'm like, yeah, sure. You know, it'd be super fun. And then he started working on bags, and he wanted to design like a DJ bag, like a record, you know, bag that could hold like 40 albums. So we collaborated on that together. And then one day we were I think we were probably working on the DJ bag, and Dwayne, my boss, gives me a pair of Jordan 3s that are in Michael's size. So they're size 13 and a half. And I was just, you know, we were looking at them, and Alan just cracks a joke like, dude, you could put a laptop in those things. And I just thought it was hilarious. So I drew it. I drew like the outsole of the Jordan 1 and the design of the Jordan 1 kind of like morphing into a laptop bag, like a shoulder bag. And the time, the head of marketing was Gentry Humphreys. And Gentry comes by and he's like, Mike, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's this, you know, just a joke. You know, Alan made a joke. I thought it was funny. I drew it. And he's like, hey, can I borrow that? And I was like, yeah, sure. He comes back like a few hours later. He's like, yeah, I just met with Foot Locker. Here, buy it.
No way.
I was like, well, this is nothing. He's like, well, it's something now. So we got it's a project now.
Do they still sell that bag?
No.
Especially with all like the throwback stuff that goes on?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I think for me, I think it's just a little curiosity, a little desire to do some extra work. You know, every year they would redo the Jordan typeface. And so in one year I was like, I want to work on it. And Dwayne was like, yeah, go talk to the brand guys and go work on the typeface. And same, I had to go over to the timing guys that had a watch group at the time. And like, hey, can I work on a watch with you guys? Like, I've done watches before. And I'm like, yeah, sure. So no one's going to turn down free work. And to me, that was the cool thing about being at this company with such a broad global reach. And it was to be a part of all these things. And even though I was in-house, I could operate almost like a consultant as long as I got my core work done.
Right.
Yeah. And to the point where I remember John asking me, he's like a very deep thinker. And he's like, you know, Michael, like, you don't like sports. You don't play sports. You're working in Jordan. And like, the athletes love you because you don't kiss their butts because you don't watch sports.
Right.
And I remember like Carmelo, I was presenting something to Carmelo once, and he was like, hey, did you see me in the game last night? I was like, no, did you see me draw this shoe for you last night? And he was like,
Carmelo Anthony.
Yeah. He's like, this guy's funny. You know, like,
that's hilarious.
I mean, I was trying to crack wise, but then as it's coming out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, that might be not the nicest thing to say.
Right.
But he thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
So John asked me, he's like, I want you to put together a presentation on like why this brand matters to you. Why do you care about this brand? Because you're doing great work, but you don't care about sports. And so I put together this video presentation. It's inspired by my brother.
I was about to say, did you hire your brother to video?
No, but I think iMovie had just come out, so
right.
And so I had this concept, this idea that I did like this little like brand mark for the video that was like the swoosh with a square root symbol around it, to like trying to get at like what's the core, what's the square root of the swoosh. And so I was like, Nike equals sports, right? But what are sports? And sports are, at their core, the celebration of human achievement, right? Like somebody does something and they win, right? And so once you level it down to the celebration of human achievement, well, you're like, is Picasso in this brand? Is Albert Einstein in this brand? Like, who
isn't in
right,
this brand?
Right. Anyone that's done something that you're like, that surprises you. And that, to me, that's why, I was watching like highlight reels of like MJ all the time, because I didn't love basketball, but I'm like, just look at that. That's
right.
Like this person is doing stuff that we didn't think was possible, right? And so I put together this whole video on that. It's like a 30 or 45-second video. And John was like, let's set up a meeting with Wyden Kennedy, the ad agency, and pitch him the video.
Oh my God, everything you touched was like turning to gold, it seems.
And it was just, again, I think it's just the desire to do extra work. So then...
But you're also creatively, I think that's very humble of you, and that's very nice. But on the same note, like you're coming up with some like really solid material.
There was an idea there, yeah.
That's amazing.
And so, after 2.5 years in Jordan, one of my really close friends from sportswear became head of all design for Converse, Scott Patt, who's now chief design officer at Cole Haan. And when we sat next to each other for like 2 years in sportswear and just, got lunch every day. We were super close. So he was like, and Nike had just bought Converse, and he was like, I need some help over here. And they had a small performance and innovation group. They actually had, Dwayne Wade was sponsored athlete at the time. And he's like, could you be design director for this group? Because I need the help. And so, I accepted the job. It was a huge promotion. And, I resigned from Jordan. And, I remember the VP in Jordan, Howard White, he was so mad at me. Like, and he didn't talk to me for like 6 months. And I'd pass him in the hallway. He wouldn't talk to me. And then finally one day, H is like, hey, Mike, how you doing? Blah, blah. I'm like, oh, we're talking again. Like,
you're not mad at me?
Yeah. I'm like, and I asked him, I'm like, what happened, H? Like, why were you mad at me? He's like, 'cause you left. I'm like, yeah, but these guys like offered me a huge promotion, and I had to go for it. He's like, oh, I get it. I understand. He's like, I just wish you had talked to me. And I was like, well, I just figured like, what would you care? He's like, what do you mean? What would I care? Of course I care.
Yeah, he's missing your talent now.
Yeah. He's like, I just thought I was just, the young kid designer that nobody cared about. He's like, no, you made my job hard. I had to explain to Michael why you left. I'm like, he doesn't know who I am. He's like, yeah, he does. And like, it had to be like, this dude just left without talking to me, So yeah, I was a little pissed.
Wow.
He's like, but I'm over it. It's fine. And he's like, you come back anytime.
So the life lesson learned, I guess.
Well, and yeah, I think, just to your point of, I didn't value myself. Right. And so I just was like, well, I'm a good designer on a team of good designers, and
and you probably don't know your worth to some degree because you're just doing what you love every day.
Yeah, and like I said, everybody on that team was solid. Dwayne Edwards was the director who went on to found Pencil. Jason Maiden was one of my best friends, still one of my best friends. We text all the time. Who he went on to leave Nike, go to Stanford, work for a bunch of venture capitalists in the Bay Area before starting his own brand called Super Heroic, which is a kids footwear brand that Magic Johnson's an investor in. Anyway, everybody on the team was awesome. Right?
Yeah,
so
everybody's somebody.
Yeah, it's like the Super Friends or whatever, Avengers or something.
The Avengers of Nike design.
Yeah, so I thought I was, Hawkeye. Like no one's gonna miss me if I'm not in this episode. You know? I did not maybe realizing maybe I was Iron Man. So anyway, yeah, that was an important lesson. And 3.5 years later, when I left Nike, when I left Converse altogether to go to Frog, because Frog Design offered me, I was sure not to repeat that mistake. And I was talking to Scott, who was my boss, basically, about it, and getting his advice before I even accepted the Frog offer. And he was like, "You got to call John." And I was like, "Do I?" I was like, "I think so, but like, it's also an awkward conversation." He's like, "No, he will be so hurt if you don't call him." And so, I called him. He's chief design officer. I was just like, I had my voicemail message queued up. Like, I knew exactly what I was going to say into his voicemail.
But he answered.
He answered on the first ring.
Oh,
and he was like, DiTullo, what's up? And I was like, oh, hey, John.
Hey.
Yeah. Do you have a minute? Is this a good time? He's like, well, I'm driving to a board meeting. He's like, I'm about 15 minutes late, but I got 5 minutes before I get there. Why don't you start? And just tell me what's on your mind. I'm like, I don't think it's a 5-minute conversation. He's like, well, just start, and then I'll call you after. I was like, okay, well, I think I'm going to quit Nike. And I heard the car pull over. I heard the car turn off and pull over. And I was just like, he's like, okay, let's start from the beginning.
Oh, no.
And so, I told him that Frog Design, which was started in 1969, did a lot of the early Apple work, the original Sony Walkman, was offering me a role as creative director of their San Francisco studio, which is their headquarters studio. They have like 8 studios around the world. And it's kind of like a once in a lifetime thing to go back to consulting and work with these giant companies. And he was quiet, for a little bit. And he's like, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to take that job. And he's like, and if you don't like that job, in 2 weeks, you'll call me and you have your job back. He's like, but I'm going to remove the fear out of the situation completely. He's like, because I know you're scared, and I just appreciate that you called me, and that means the world to me. And he's like, I appreciate that you're not going to a competitor. That means the world to me. He's like, and he's like, I know I can make you scared enough to stay. I know I can write you a big enough check to stay. He's like, and I also know that in 5 years, they'll just hate me. He's like, so go take the job. And in 5 years, if you want to come back, call me, come back.
That's incredible.
And I don't know if I have been in a situation where people have quit on me, and I don't think I've had that much grace. I don't know what the word is. Humility. Like,
well, there's also a level of respect there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't going to ask this question until this came up, but like, was that sort of the corporate culture of Nike where, I mean, obviously it feels like a family because these people are really, really hurt, right?
Yeah,
when you don't talk to these people, and now that you are, I mean, that obviously ups your game of respect as well. So it works. Yeah. It's a two-way street.
I always told people when I was there, and it's gotten a lot bigger, but it was big then. At the time, campus was 5,000 or 6,000 people. I always told people that it was a small company that happened to be big. And that's kind of how it felt at the time.
This is the best.
Yeah.
Because you have the resources, but yet you have the personality and the emotion of caring about each other.
And the thing about Nike, though, is that every group is really different. The groups are very autonomous. They all report up, but Jordan really operated as its own business.
Sure. It feels that way. Yeah. It almost feels like a different company.
But even like Nike running operates like it's its own business.
True.
And so your experience there could be really different based on who is running your group. And I think I just happened to work in 3 groups in a row, sportswear, Jordan, and Converse, where it was really people were really caring. And I have to say, like, there's maybe something in the Northwest culture, like the Portland culture is also really caring. And so maybe that's a part of it. I don't know, I think, but definitely, but I would go back, it's a great place.
I mean, obviously, like, you can't say that about every company.
Yeah.
Let alone one that big.
And I think honestly, like, lucky in a way that maybe made me a little naive, right? Like my first boss out of school at Aaron with Aaron was amazing. So I was like, oh, all bosses are great. But I did have one terrible boss at Nike, and I was like, what's going on? This guy's not great. And then
Did he get weeded out anyway?
I think he's still there, but we won't mention. But
Sure.
But then I had Dwayne as a boss, who was amazing, and John, who was amazing, and Scott. And then, working consulting again at Frog, where, it's a much bigger consultancy, 500-person consultancy. And we were typically hired by someone in the C-suite, if not the CEO, a COO or a CMO, to do a project, and really getting to peek under the hood at a lot of different companies. And you're like, wow, like I just thought all companies were nice and great and wanted to do the best. And I quickly found that was not always the case. And so I tried to make it part of my job to help, how can I not only do a great design project for them, but how could I also be kind of an example of leadership? And it's kind of nice. I have a few clients now that I have my own studio, where we do just have like a rolling retainer agreement. And part of the agreement is I mentor their team, and, just spending time one-on-one with their team and spending time one-on-one with their CEO every month to talk about strategy and employee retention. And, I think that's fun for me. It's to me, it's all design,
That's really cool. I wouldn't have thought that, like, as a consultant, that would even be a part of the equation. Like, let's talk employee retention.
Yeah. I think in terms of like,
I'm sure that's crazy value added.
Yeah. And how do we, it's specifically like, it's like, how do we grow like our product design team? How do we keep them engaged? How do we take this junior employee and help him to become a leader, right? And so I've lived that. So it's something that I'm well placed to give advice on. And it's great when you do the most recent case that I'm doing this is with a company in Solana Beach here called Piguet, and they're growing really fast. And the CEO is smart enough to know that he needs help with just like, hey, how do I grow these they used to be individual people, and now they're work groups, and those work groups are going to become divisions, right? If the company continues to grow at this rate. And so he's smart enough to pull in a few consultants, like myself on the design side. He's pulled in someone on the finance side to augment him and help him. And I love working for people like that who are smart enough
to know what they don't know.
To be humble.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, so, all right, obviously you left Nike, then you go to Converse, then you went to Frog.
Right.
How did you get to Southern California?
So Frog is in San Francisco. We were living in Russian Hill. I always wanted to live in San Francisco. There's this amazing kind of design recruiter who he's kind of like one of those guys, like you don't call him, he calls you, and once you get to a certain level, basically he'll find out about you. And so this guy had been trying to get me to leave Nike for a few years, and he's just he's great. He's very consultative, like he wants to get to know you, blah, blah, blah. And like one day he called me and he pitched me a thing. And I was like, look, Tom, like, unless you got something that's like creative director of Frog Design, he's like, all right, good to know. 2 weeks later, he called me. He's like, okay, so I got you an interview with Frog Design. I'm like, what? So that's just, that's how he rolls.
Wow, that's awesome.
So, and at Frog, I was working with, I was on the Intel account. I was on the Google account, doing hardware for Google. I was on a Honda account, a Chinese startup car company called Koros. We worked on their first production model, a bunch of great brands. But so
were you designing cars for Honda?
Yeah, we worked on an EV program.
Right.
That was a concept car. So this small company, or compared to Honda, a small company here in San Diego reached out to us, and we ended up there. It's a conglomerate called DEI Holdings, and they own Polk Audio, Definitive Technology, which is an audiophile brand, and a startup audio brand called Boom. And they had a new president, smart guy, Princeton undergrad, Stanford grad, and it's just like, we don't know. We have all these different audio brands. They're all kind of stepping on each other's toes. So they had hired us to do a design language across all of them. So we did ethnographic research, interviewing users, and we built out a strategy. We redesigned all the brand logos, did a design language for each brand, and kind of what I call kind of an innovation center. So it's like, what will each brand work on from an innovation standpoint?
So how were they stepping on each other's toes from like a product assortment standpoint or a demographic, or were they different price points?
Yeah.
Or?
I mean, Definitive was the most expensive, but of course they wanted to come down a little bit in price so they can get more volume. Sure. Polk was kind of the mid-tier, and they wanted to, both go up in price so they could get more legitimacy, and go down in price so they can get more volume. And Boom was just like the upstart that was like, hey, can you guys stop smashing us between these two rocks? And so we just wanted to give a clear voice for each brand. And so kind of like the shortcut was that, Boom became about kind of millennial college students. Polk became kind of about Gen Xers who were kind of nesting into homes with families, and Definitive became more about empty nester boomers who like just wanted the best thing. Right. And they had very different sound signatures, and so we developed a design language that complemented those sound signatures, where Definitive was like super crisp, super precise, so all the product design was very geometric, lots of brushed aluminum and black. And Polk sound signature, going all the way back to the 70s, was very warm, more musical, more like an instrument. So everything we were doing for Polk was wood and leather, no silver, kind of like a warm tone nickel finishes on metals, and then like very rounded. And then Boom was just all about this kid who was basically going to do his best to destroy the product. So it was all about kind of really fun, poppy shapes and colors that were as indestructible as possible. So I had worked with those guys for about 6 months at Frog, and we'd done a huge amount of billables with them. And eventually they were like, hey, why don't you just come down here? Right. You're coming down to Southern California.
Kind of like Nike did with you, basically.
Basically, we had a conversation, and ended up building the team from they had one designer, and over a 5-year period, built it to 20 people, renamed the company from DEI Holdings to Sound United. That was more about collecting and stewarding and curating these audio brands. Right. Helped, was part of the team that saw them as they purchased Marantz and Denon. And then, so grew much bigger, and designed the headquarters building. So, and basically I had 2 teams. By the end of 5 years, I had 2 teams reporting to me. The first was a industrial design team designing the products, and the second was a marketing creative team we were doing the print ads, launch videos, displays in the store. So it was really cool because I was able to kind of control creative across everything, down to like what it said on the tag at Best Buy. So,
oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So like soup to nuts.
Yeah, totally. From what is it, what should we make for who, to the littlest details.
That's awesome. Okay, guys, just want to take a quick second and talk to you about Passion Fine Jewelry. Tim Jackson was last week's guest. Passion Fine Jewelry is his company and store based in Solana Beach, California. He's been gracious enough to come on as our first sponsor for the podcast. Also, just a very, very great resource if you're into watches and have any interest whatsoever in independent watches in particular. Tim is a phenomenal resource. You can reach him through Instagram, Passion Fine Jewelry, also passionfinejewelry.com. He also has a very educational blog called independentintime.com. Check that out for more information. But thanks, Tim, for the support. Really appreciate it. All of you guys need to check him out if you're interested in watches. Thanks. Now back to my conversation with Michael. What do you consider to be good design? Like what defines good design?
I think good design does three things. The first thing is obvious. Like, it has to solve a real problem for a real person. Sometimes you see something and you're like, what's that really for? Is that really a real thing that needs a product? It has to really be a part of someone's life and help improve it. The second thing we don't usually like to talk about, but is true because we're designers, not artists, is that it has to be commercially viable, right? It has to be able to be produced for a profit. It has to be able to be distributed. It has to be able to be sold. So, sometimes we're thinking about things like, hey, how many of these can you put on a pallet? Like, how many of these will fit on a shelf at Target? Because it's all part of it, and that can make a huge difference. And then the third thing that's super important to me is, like, it has to somehow benefit culture. And that's that kind of like magical extra little something that like Jordan has, where you're like, yeah, okay, that's a great basketball shoe, and clearly like they have figured out how to sell a basketball shoe for $200, but so it's profitable. But there is a whole culture around that brand that is part of the person. It's partly the marketing. It's partly the product, and so that's this extra like third heat that I try to bring to everything that I work on is how does this make you more important to the culture at large? Because you have competitors, right? And so if you're only making a very functional product that works, that can be sold, well, that's a commodity game, right? And you can make something that's good, but you could lose your brand over that. But if you add that third thing, that's when you start to make something that's truly good.
As far as like color theory is concerned, like what is the theory of color? I mean, I don't know if it's that literal or not, but like you hear about color theory. Mm-hmm. There's obviously like color trends, things like that. Like what role does color play?
Yeah, it's huge. And context is, there's trends, there's the core theory that never changes, complementary colors, primary, tertiary, understanding how they work together. That never goes away. That's an academic learning. And then there's trends, right? Like, it's like we've moved from these brighter, poppier colors to dustier pastels that you see coming in. So you're like, okay, I understand that. And then there's the context of like, well, that just doesn't work in the kitchen or on a shoe. So you have to kind of combine all three of those things in a way that makes it kind of relevant for who you're trying to talk to with the product. Sure. And that's something that honestly I've learned so much from my wife Christina on. So she has an undergrad in illustration, and just color is really important to her. And it's like she paints, does a lot of oil painting, and she never uses a color out of the tube. She's always mixing, and she'll spend like an hour mixing colors before she even paints. And I've just learned a lot from her on how important that is and how to use color strategically. Like I think we're all guilty of this as consumers, where I'll see a shoe on the wall at Foot Locker and be like, wow, check out that freaking bright red shoe. Or it's like salmon red. And you're like, that's awesome. And you go up to it and you're like, oh, cool. Also comes in just white. Sweet. Right. And like, that's a strategy where you're like, hey, we're going to make the shoe in 3 to 5 colors. And we're going to do one like super wild on trend color. And we're not going to make very many of them because we're not going to sell them. But it's going to bring people to the wall. And then they're going to buy the white one, the black one, or the navy one, right?
Right.
So
it's like fishing.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And so
you bait them with color, and then
yeah.
sell them the product in a variation of it.
And helping clients to understand that could be tricky because it's an inventory management strategy as much as it's a product strategy.
Absolutely. Like, how deep in the buy do you go based on the pessimism of selling that particular color?
Because the one thing I've learned about inventory management is like you're never going to be right. The question is how wrong will you be? Right. So you want to manage that.
Yeah, mitigating mistakes versus striving for excellence.
But I've definitely been in meetings with financial people where they'll pull out a spreadsheet and they're like, well, 90% of the sales are black and white. So why don't we just not ship that 10% of bright blue or red? And like, yeah, because that 10% is getting you the 90%. Yeah. Or it's contributing, right? And that's the one that's going to be on blogs. That's the one that's going to be in magazines. That's the one that celebrities are going to wear.
The peacock.
Yeah. And a certain amount of trendsetters will wear it, just not very many, but you need it, because if it's just in black and white, it's just another black and white thing at Best Buy or at Foot Locker or wherever.
Yeah. So as a designer, like, how do you personally, like, how do you find your own voice as far as like your design aesthetic goes and that sort of thing? Like, forgive me for saying this, but I always, like, when I look at your sketches, it's almost like you are the embodiment of the Jetsons.
Yeah.
Like, it's very mid-century, but it's also futuristic. It's curvaceous, the way that like everything in that TV show was curved.
Right.
Or like an oval, or like a peaked sort of an orb.
Yeah.
Right. Like, that's how I would describe kind of your aesthetic and the shapes and things. But how do you do that? And this is the collective you now. Like, how does one find their own design voice?
Yeah, I think it has to be for me, it comes from a place of optimism, and it's just who I am and it's the world that I want to see. You know, I'm not a very cynical designer. You know, and you just kind of, sometimes you see stuff and you're like, oh, that's just another rehash or something with a pigeon on it, though, and you're like, it just feels cynical to me, you know, and you know, whatever. But
it just made me think of Portlandia.
Yeah,
like you put a bird on it.
Yeah, and like, I don't know, it doesn't feel good to me. And my thing is like, how can we get one step closer to the future? And you know, I call that aesthetic that I'm trying to mine, I call it friendly future. Because you see, like you see in automotive design, you're like, man, how many angry predator faces run through the Optimus Prime filter do we need on the road, you know? Right. And I want things that are friendly and point to maybe a better tomorrow that we're striving towards. And I think that is a philosophy that was really embodied in the 1950s and early 60s in design. You know, there was a lot that needed to be improved in the world at that time. But,
hence the curvatures, like something softer, nothing too angular and aggressive.
And
interesting.
A little simpler.
Yeah.
And I really try to highlight whatever feature is there. So I remember, like, I was working on this phone for Motorola a few years back, and it was an early phone with like RFID in it. And so this was, I guess it was like 10 years ago now, but I wanted to, and they also had some really cool Kevlar capabilities. Motorola had really kind of mined that space of like, how do you make a consumer electronics housing out of Kevlar? So I wanted to create this almost like space frame out of Kevlar that exposed the chip and then had like a clear resin over everything, so it was protected. And so it was very futuristic and simple and a little soft, but was grounded in showing off a key expertise that they were trying to push forward.
So it'd be like showing the tourbillon in a watch, or like a skeletonized movement.
It's exactly like a exposed case back on a watch, where you're like, let's turn that into a phone. It's some cool stuff going on in there.
Yeah, sure. So how do you, day in, day out, like how do you challenge yourself these days? Like, if you have your own voice, right? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you step outside of that box?
And you have to invest in yourself, and the way I do that is mainly with time and somewhat with money, but I mean, both of us like to travel, and so it's like, you might have to go to London for a couple of weeks, or just sometimes in your own backyard and be a tourist, and so you need to. I need to schedule time for that, and so I try to run my practice where I only have a certain amount of billable hours, and then the rest of that time I'm hunting. I'm out there looking at things, and not always in the human-made world. Sometimes in the natural world, and I've learned and grown.
Sure.
Because you have to you have to be inspired. You have to put ingredients in the pantry. And I remember one of my professors, this guy Larry Brinker, who worked at Nissan when I was doing the sponsored work at Nissan. He told me, he's like, Michael, like, you design everything from your heart, and that's really admirable. But he's like, someday you'll reach in there and there's not going to be anything left. And
that's kind of dark.
It's kind of dark. When you're 20 years old, you're like, what? And he's like, you got to start putting stuff in. And he told me this. We were in Milan at the time when he told me this. And he's like, you got to take time off and, go to art museums and see the world and
stretch the legs.
Yeah. And I think it's been, that's one of the many balances that Christina, my wife, provides, is like she's always getting us out to art openings and getting to concerts and traveling. And I'm lucky because she just is like, here's all the things going on right now. Which ones do you want to go to? And it's just setting that time aside. Because otherwise, like, I look at it as like, I also get lucky in that I get to see a lot of different companies and a lot of different products, and there's a lot of cross-pollination. But if you're designing footwear all the time or watches all the time, you can get really insular. And before you know it, you're just drawing the same thing over and over again. And it gets harder and harder to break out of those deep grooves. So I've just always been somebody that's really been interested in that. And because of that, that third piece of good design we talked about being that good design is part of culture. Well, if you want to make something that's part of culture, you have to be a part of culture too.
Is there any like particular item you've designed where it's like the inspiration behind it was so far from what people would have thought? Like, can you think of something that you, I don't even know of an example. Like, what would be yours?
I remember way back in my career, I was working at Evo. We were doing a bunch of watches for Timex, and I was working on some metal bands. And, so you're wearing
the bracelet, a part of a watch.
Yeah, and so I was really studying the way metal bracelets work and interlink. And at the same time, I was working on a project for Nike, and they wanted us to make a really flexible, lightweight, more minimalist running shoe. This is like maybe 2002, 2001. And so I designed a shoe where the bottom was like a bunch of linked together blocks of foam that were, like a watch bracelet. And I remember Dave from Nike being like, well, we couldn't do that. We can't like pin together pieces of foam because it'll just like explode when you're running. Right. He's like, but it's a cool idea. And he's like, we'll take it in-house and work on it. And that nugget of an idea becomes Nike free, right? You're like all those blocks
the soul for Nike free.
I would never have thought of, they put these really deep blades in the tool to make these independently moving blocks. But, I think the genesis of that could have come from that project where you're like, it was all based because I was working on a watch in the morning and a shoe in the afternoon, Wow. So I think that happens quite a bit. I've done a lot of work for Icon, and in the work for Icon, it's, most of the work I've done is very mass produced, where it's injection molded or some kind of a really high volume mass production process. But working with Icon, where they're
Icon 4x4, Jonathan Ward's company.
Yeah, where they're making things in the dozens, right? Not the hundreds of thousands.
Right, nothing with a comma.
Yeah. Except the price.
Fair enough.
A couple commas in that.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah, and well deserved. But understanding like, everything has to be CNC'd or bent out of metal and brake formed, and so I was learning tons about manufacturing processes that I knew nothing about before, or I knew conceptually what CNCing was, but once you get into the real limitations, you understand a lot more. And then I would eventually those learnings would find their way into other things. So.
What were some of the projects you worked on with Jonathan?
Shout out Jonathan.
Yeah, I worked on the first project I worked on with him was the gauge cluster of the FJ, so the original gauge cluster, and then
those look so good too.
Yeah, and then for the CJs, I worked on the whole front face of the CJ. Gauge cluster and some of the interior detailing on the Bronco. Then we did a bunch of other stuff together. That some of that never saw the light of day, like an Icon Bullet Mustang, and an Icon Aston Martin DB4.
Oh wow!
Yeah, which would have been amazing. That just never saw the light of day. And then there's a Plymouth Superbird that isn't complete yet, but it's been on in hotrod.com and stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
We've done a few other projects together.
So, is there any difference really in pursuing a car versus a watch versus a shoe? I mean, other than the obvious, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, that you have to drive that. You know what I mean? But like, is the approach the same? Does it change ever?
So I think for me, it's a similar approach in that each one has unique parameters, right? Like, well, the shoe, you need to understand the foot form, and it's got to be built around a last, and it has to respond to the biomechanics of the body, but also has to respond to fashion. And there's the parameters, right? And you're designing a cell phone. You're like, oh, it's got to fit
in somebody's hand,
and it's got to fit the screen, the battery, and the PCB. And so there's these kind of core parameters you need to understand across every industry. And I just try to take that into account with my process of we just really phase one is discover. So it's all about what are the unique parameters of this product type, what are the unique features and benefits you can provide, and then who is this for and who is your brand. Right. And then phase two is exploration, where we're really just, okay, now that we understand those parameters, let's explore around them. Let's play with them. Let's turn some up and some down. Let's overemphasize some and ignore others in an attempt to get somewhere new. And then in the third phase, we're really working with the client to down select and then develop that idea for production.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Speaking of cars, what are you currently driving these days? Standard H podcast, clearly. Got to bring up the personal car.
So I have a 2001 Audi TT Quattro Spider in Nimbus Gray with a baseball glove optic stitch interior that I've had. It's a 01. I've had it since 05.
When did that car come out?
I think 99.
I was going to say within a couple of years of that.
Yeah.
Because that's the original Bauhaus
totally
kind of inspired design.
I just always loved it. I mean, I think it was on the auto show circuit in 95. And I went to the auto show with my wife, and she was like, what's that car? And I'm like, oh, it's the Audi TT. She's like, I love that car. I'm like, oh, they're never going to, they'll never make that. And she's like, why? I'm like, oh, it's too simple. It's too... I mean, it is my design aesthetic. It's very
100%.
It's kind of optimistically futuristic, friendly.
But then you also have the baseball glove stitching, which is just so
even
and so American for such a German company.
It's true, yeah,
and a German design philosophy.
Yeah. And she was like, they're going to make that car, and we're going to own it someday. And so I was always just kind of
that's awesome, Christina.
Yeah, I was always looking at cars.com for a used one. And I saw this one pop up. It was literally right down the road from Nike. And I test drove it. I negotiated it. I had just gotten a job at Jordan. The dealer was a huge Jordan fan, and he was a size 9, which is the prototype size. So I hooked him up with a bunch of Jordans as I negotiated the price down. And then on Saturday, Christina was like, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? I'm like, well, we're going to go test drive a TT. It's all negotiated. I had it all checked out. It's just...
she didn't know you were doing it.
No, it's just all whether you want it or not. And she's like, we will go and test drive it because I want to test drive that car. She's like, but we are not buying it. I'm like, okay, don't worry. And I had an MR2 at the time. So I was like, why don't you drive the MR2 there so you can feel what that feels like.
It was a light car too.
Yeah,
MR2.
Super light. And then we'll test drive the TT, and the dealer's like, yeah, go. He just let us take it. 5 minutes into the drive, her smiling from ear to ear. I'm like, what do you think? She's like, we are not leaving here today without this car.
That's amazing.
So we've had it ever since.
That's awesome.
So that's kind of my car. And then she has a Volkswagen Golf R 2017, I think.
Wait, so you have the TT.
Right.
But she was the one that was like, we will own this car one day.
Yeah, it's just always been my car. I don't know.
That's funny.
And then she just, both of us love to drive and drive fast. So she has the Golf R. And we pretty much switch. We switch a lot.
The TT's manual, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. Basically, if I have to drive more than 30 miles, we'll switch cars because she's an old girl at this point,
Right.
So, and the Golf R is just amazing. And before I had the Golf R, I had an Audi S3, and it's pretty much the same running gear. So,
That's awesome.
yeah.
Favorite cars of all time?
Oh man, it's like if I had to go one car, I'd probably go Aston Martin DB4 Zagato. It's just an amazing car.
Yeah.
Kind of a cliche, but Mercedes-Benz 300 Gullwing.
Oh, sure.
It's just beautiful.
Icon.
Yeah.
Or iconic.
Yeah.
It's not actually an icon.
Yeah, right.
Going back to icon.
Right. There's like half a dozen Ferraris I could pick from, but I tend to really like those very smooth racers from the late 50s, early 60s, when they knew enough about aerodynamics that they knew it should be smooth, but not enough to realize that actually was terrible.
Right.
Before everything became kind of like a wedge that was all about downforce, right?
Yeah.
They were trying to make these like, Jaguar E-type fuselage, very aerodynamic, more fluid dynamic shapes. And I just think, to me, those things still look like the future.
Sure. So, crossing from automotive into horology, watches, things of that nature. You're kind of a watch guy. What you had a recent watch collaboration, actually?
Yeah, I did a piece with Carpenter Watches, Neil Carpenter, out of Brooklyn. Just a really cool boutique watch brand. So I got to work on a special edition with them called the M18, which is really cool. It's the first brand collaboration for us. So it's the first product I've ever done that has my logo on the back.
So what does M18 represent?
It's just the 18th
okay.
edition.
I didn't know if that was like 2018.
No, it's a good question. No.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That model is called the M model.
So how would you describe that aesthetic? Obviously, we're not visual here on the the airwaves.
It's a field. It's basically a field watch case with an exposed back and an a Japanese automatic movement. And it's a beautiful case. It's just really simple, and I wanted to really kind of highlight it and show it off in a new way. It had always been it's their case, but they had always done kind of a classic field watch dial. There's a lot of numerals on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to just bring it maybe one notch over to my aesthetic. So we did a super high polish on the case to really show off the lines, and then a micro perf for the band, giving it a little bit more of like an automotive sport vibe. Sure. And then the face has no numerals. It's just hour indices in white, and then these really, really faint tonal gray second indices. And then the second, like the one thing that pops on it is that the second hand is 021C Pantone orange. So it's just like this very subdued object that's very beautiful, but then it's got this one little element that says, "Look at me."
Yeah. That's cool. Why orange?
It's kind of
I mean, it looks great against gray and
Yeah.
things of that nature, but why? Because you think of like the Speedmaster just came out with like the Ultraman that's got the orange second hand.
that color is just, just looking around.
The chairs out here, yeah.
It's kind of a little bit of an inside joke. One of my friends, Richard Kaczynski, who's also an independent designer, is like, I always know it's a DiTullo sketch if it has 021C orange on it. And so since this, in this case, the brand was really, I wouldn't normally make a color palette based on what I personally like, but in this case, the brand is reaching out to collaborate with my brand. Not with me as a designer, but with me as a brand. And so it felt appropriate.
So then I have to ask, because your logo is blue.
It's just they're complementary colors on the
true.
the wheel, and those are the two colors that it's like straight cyan blue and 021.
Oh, that's funny.
Orange.
Okay.
And I never use them together because it's like
it's a lot.
It's like the New York Mets at that point, right?
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
But I use them in isolation.
What are some of your favorite watches? Speaking of watches, do you have any?
I really like a lot of like the classic square tags.
Monaco.
Yeah. Oh man, it's just like a beautiful case.
Blue dial.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm not like.
So that's very 70s.
It's
right?
very 70s.
You know?
It's true. It's not very smooth. I like some of the classic like Omega divers, and even like and then like you get into like some of like the Seiko divers, like really big chunky Seiko divers, like freaking
the
awesome.
newer stuff.
Newer, but and they have some older ones. I mean, they also go back pretty far, but they did kind of re-release them, that kind of like half exposed turn ring and stuff recently. Right. Some really cool stuff. And then I mean, the not great horology, but the designer in me really loves a lot of like the lip stuff.
Oh, sure.
You know, like just really kind of goofy, fun.
That's kind of the Jetsons version of the watch, I would say.
Totally. Yeah. I'm pretty predictable, I guess.
Yeah. Well, no, that's all good.
And I think that's why I like some of those like big chunky Omega divers too, where you're like just the lugs are like really integrated, and it just especially like when you pair that with like the diving strap, like those chainmail straps, and you're like, oh, it just feels really cool. Sure. Yeah.
Well, just taking it real quick back to business, because we've touched obviously several times on you owning your own business. Yeah. So what took you? So obviously you were at Sound United. Mm-hmm. What drove you to go out on your own finally?
I always wanted to have my own studio, and going back to that Raymond Loewy, Giorgio Giugiaro inspiration from when I was young. And I mean, I always respect people tremendously like Dieter Rams and Johnny Ive, who have made their career at a company. I have like just like a restless spirit in me that just couldn't make that happen. And it's just like you look at Raymond Loewy and Hartmut Esslinger, who started Frog Design right out of school. They just kind of like marched to their own drummer. And so I always wanted to start my own studio, but I also wanted to have a big enough portfolio, enough experience, and a big enough network that I felt like we could do it successfully. And so when I was leaving Frog, before I took the job at Sound United, I was considering going out and starting my own studio. Actually, I was talking about potentially partnering with a good friend of mine, Howard Nook, who is he's now one of the partners, one of the owners for Palm, the reboot of Palm. And so, and the opportunity came up at Sound United, and I was like, well, this is almost like a chance to start my own studio, build a 20-person team, but basically somebody else is paying for it. And we're operating a bit like a consulting agency for this company that owns a lot of brands. And so I just set a time limit for myself, 5 years. And I made it like 5 years to the day. And usually my wife is like, I think it's time. I think you've done all the things you said you wanted to do. You've checked all the boxes you said you wanted to check off. Because we've been together since I was 19. And,
wow.
And I think like on our third date, she asked me what I wanted to do who I wanted to be when I grow up. And I said I wanted to be the next Raymond Loewy. And so she's always been like a part of that. She understands the mission.
Well, as an artist too, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and she's like, I think it's time. And I was really scared. It was 2 years ago, a couple weeks ago. I was really scared, but I just like the process I described of like discover, design, deliver. I did like a discovery phase where I interviewed a bunch of small business owners and people I trust to try to understand like if they could go back in time and give themselves some advice, what advice would they give me?
Sure, yeah.
So I could, put together a good business plan for myself. And I think I talked to 12 or 15 people, and 5 or 6 of those asked me to write proposals. And I didn't even have a business yet. So by the time I had left Sound United, I had several proposals out there, and on my first day of the business, the first one signed. And
so in talking to these people about starting the business,
yeah, I started the business.
They actually offered you business.
Yes, yeah.
It's funny. I had a buddy of mine. We were having breakfast like not long ago up in San Francisco, and he was talking about how like when you ask for advice, you get money. And when you ask for money, you oftentimes get advice.
That's funny. I never heard that, but I think
that's
either. Exactly what happened.
I thought it was kind of genius.
Yeah.
I don't know where he heard it. But,
yeah.
So, well, now that you're off on your own, 2 years into it. Congrats.
Thanks.
What's been the hardest part?
I think the hardest part, there's been a lot of amazing parts, right? It's like I can be anywhere and work. The technology is so different than it was in 1998 when I graduated. Actually, had dinner with my first boss recently, and I'm like, how did you do it? And he's like, what do you mean? He's just like, you had to rent a big office, get a receptionist, a phone system. Like,
right, yeah.
I have like a laptop and an iPhone, and like all the people that work for me are all over, like they all live all over the place. And, we use a lot of cloud-based tools. So it's like, as soon as they click like save on a CAD file, like I get notified and like check it out and give them feedback no matter where I'm traveling for clients. So that's been the amazing part. The hard part is going from, I had built this 20-person team and I had all these resources. So I have to be much scrappier. And I have to be very clear with clients of what they will get and what they won't get, because, as a creator, as a maker, you never want to say no, right? You always want to say yes, because you want to do work. And, so I've had to learn how to have those conversations of when someone says, hey, can you do this? Can you guys do this? Like, yeah, we can definitely do that. And here's how much it will cost. Just like you have to be able to
put your foot down.
Well, and just be upfront. And I've also realized that almost like nobody minds. And if somebody did mind, it's like not the kind of person you want to work with anyway.
Bingo.
Right? So, and most times it's just been, I think most of my time is spent trying to find those clients who understand the value and want to do great things. Because I'm only as good as my client is, right? I can't force them to do good work. Once I do my work, they have to kind of like carry the football into the end zone, right? So if they don't want to do that, it's not going to happen.
Well, and especially, you're somewhat of a hired gun, right? So it's like, if they don't carry the football into the end zone, i.e. potentially make sales, right? If they don't hire the right marketing department or sales team or maybe even manufacturing facility.
Exactly.
Yeah. You stand a chance of not being hired again.
Right.
No
one's going to be happy. Right. And so that's why I will ask before we start a project all kinds of questions like, who's your manufacturing partner? Do you have one? Right. Am I going to be helping you do that work? Because now that's value add, right? Like, what's your launch plan? Like, what's the business plan for this product? And so, a lot of times they'll be like, why, as a designer, like, why do you care? I'm like, because all of those things determine the success of my work, right? Like, I could do something amazing. And if you have a terrible manufacturing partner that's going to make a piece of garbage, it's not going to matter how good your marketing and sales team is, because you're not going to have something.
You're like, I'm here to create the idea and the design behind things, not actually make the product and sell it. So if all I wanted to do is just design stuff, I could post doodles on Instagram and call it a day.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So what's been the easiest part?
I think the easiest part has been the work has been pretty fluid, and that's something like I was prepared to. I just didn't know. I didn't know how it would be. I've been so thankful at how receptive people have been to me starting the studio, and people in some cases I haven't talked to in 20 years reaching out to do projects, and it's just been a pretty steady flow of work, and that has been the best part.
That's great.
And fun work, cool projects that I'm proud of, and I think that was. I think in any creative person's heart, like if you're going to leave and start your own thing, that's the big question, because you want to make things of value that people appreciate.
Sure. Yeah. So what's the structure of the company right now?
Right now, it's just keeping it super tight. I'm almost like determined not to grow for a little bit. So right now, it's myself and running all creative, and then Christina, my wife, runs kind of the business side. So she reviews all the proposals. She looks at all the work. She kind of runs project management, interference, and then does all the finances. So she officially gets a salary now. And then
that's awesome.
Yeah. And then I have two CAD contractors that are kind of my go-to kind of design development resources. Another couple people I use on the research side. So, it kind of really depends on how busy we are, but sometimes we've been as big as 7 with contractors, and sometimes it's just been Christina and I. So again, like, the technology affords us the ability to have that kind of flexibility right now. And I don't think it will. I think we'll grow, but I really don't want to be more than 5 on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah.
I'd rather say just no to work. It's kind of my goal.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the whole beauty of working for yourself is you determine your stress level.
Right.
I mean, unless you get that, in your case, that client that's just like breathing down your neck constantly.
Yeah.
But, and I'm sure those exist, but
those are moments, though,
yeah,
right?
sure.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of blips. What advice would you give for the kid at RISD today that is like, do I go corporate?
Mm-hmm.
Do I go out on my own on the get? Like, what do you tell that student?
Great question. I think there's been with this generation, a real push in design education to get young designers to start their own businesses, which is awesome. It's great. But you don't know what you don't know. And so my advice would be, don't be afraid to take a junior designer position at a firm like I did out of school, maybe a small firm, and just get in there and learn. Like, it's not going to be forever. We've both been working long enough that we know nothing we do is really forever. Like, we've lived many lives, and just get out there and find some mentors, because people will teach you things if you just ask.
That's great. I think that's solid advice. And one takeaway, if I may just interject, is your work ethic, I think, is something that perhaps you can't even teach it, but you're either born with it or you're not. But something that I'd heard time and time again from you is that you sought out to do additional projects, So, at the very least, you're probably going to learn something in ideation, or you're going to learn something from doing more than what you're asked. I think so. That probably goes across any industry, really.
Yeah. I think I think there's 2 things I look for out of doing extra work, right? It's like, what can I learn, and what can I gain? Can I use this project? A lot of the things that we work on, I can't talk about, sometimes never, because it's like a strategy thing, or sometimes I can't talk about it for 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So, can we then use that learning project to increase our profile and get a little notoriety? So,
yeah. Do you want to talk about your book?
Sure. Yeah, that was speaking of. That was in 2017. I did this project inspired by my friend Spencer Nugent. He did a project called Sketch a Day, and I was like, I want to do a sketch a day for a year. So for a year, doing an additional sketch, concept sketch, just basically for Instagram. And I got about halfway through, and I was like, I think this is a book. And so in 2018, when the project was complete, I compiled that into a coffee table book, 365 pages of sketches. And it's just basically physical Instagram, just like the Sears catalog is a physical Amazon, right? So, and it's just really fun. I think it's just different when you can see them, 8 inches by 10 inches, versus 3 inches by 3 inches.
Sure. Well, I'm selfish in being sad about what I'm about to bring up, but you're about to leave and move up to Portland. What sparked that? What's next up there?
So there's kind of 4 key reasons that we're making the move from San Diego to Portland. And one is to be close to family. So my brother lives up there, who I mentioned several times, and his wife, who's a project manager at Ziba Design. And they have a son, Logan, who's 3, and loves cars and spaceships, and we just want to be close to them. The second reason is there's just more potential clients for me there. It's just Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, Columbia Sportswear, Intel has a big office there. So there's a lot of work. There's a Mercedes studio there.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and that's, physical proximity, even though we are in this amazing digital age, it does help some.
Sure.
The third reason is there's also a lot of design talent there. It's a really big creative culture, and so there's more young designers that I can recruit and work with, and just being a part of that creative culture there. And then the fourth reason is I'm really passionate about design education, so I think there's more of an opportunity for me to give back to that community.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Thank you for the coffee.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Wish you obviously the best of luck. You don't need luck. It
Thanks,
doesn't
Wesley.
sound like.
Yeah, thanks for
Always
having me.
good to see you.
I appreciate it.
Okay, see you soon. I'd like to thank Michael one more time for having me over. Just a really fun conversation, getting into the weeds design-wise and just talking all things creative. Hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, thank you for listening, but it does help also to subscribe to the podcast. In addition to that, please visit standard-h.com for any merchandise you'd like to pick up. Also, thank you to Clear Headphones, CLEER Headphones. Really great noise cancellation headphones, super comfortable, amazing sound. Those guys have been instrumental in helping me get this podcast off the ground. I'd like to give them a quick shout out. Also, music by Jensen Reed and Super Beautiful. Thanks again, guys, for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.